Now that the Endwalker is nearing its end, I wanted to do another tier list. This time about the difficulty of savage raids in Endwalker. A disclaimer first before we start. This tier list is not based on blind procs. Our static did proc most of it blind, but later floors like P4S, P2 or P8S, P2, we definitely didn't proc fully blind. So this tier list is based on my experience as a week 3 or 4 clearer and PF in general. So without further ado, this is Levin and welcome to Endwalker Savage Raid Difficulty Tier List. I wanted to start this in chronological order and also tell you a bit about my raiding journey in Endwalker. So first off, Asphodelus was my debut as a raid leader, and I did raid Savage in previous tier, but most of the time just PF or joining a casual static. The first static we did was an international casual static, which started late at week 2, since we wanted to watch and enjoy the world race. But since it was very casual, we had some issues with member commitments and ended up taking most of our time finding replacements and ended up clearing at week 8. So it took about 6 weeks. But we did ended up making some good friends and a really fond memory, so it was really nice for my first experience as a raid leader. So onto the first floor, Ericthonios. I'm gonna straight up put this guy at the E tier because it's probably the easiest savage in this whole expansion. It's a really great introduction to players who want to try out savage, and the most difficult mechanic is just intemperance, which you can cheese with the tank damage down. And although the MTD3 swap is very easy to do anyways and the DPS check is very lenient, it's definitely one of my favorite fights since I get to learn a lot of new classes in this floor. And I remember we often joked about it and call it the savage striking dummy, which is quite true. So the next floor, Hippocampus. This is also one of my favorite fight. I feel like this fight is very creative. The mechanic feels original, like the one with arrows, and most importantly, no positionals involved. And even though I'm a tank, it feels really good to know that you don't need to see where your D1 or D2 is positioning. So I feel like this is a very good fight, and it's a really good learning curve from P1S, as it's not very difficult to do. But I do remember early week it's quite a challenge with low eye level gears to heal and mitigate, but overall the mechanic was not too bad. Like, the limit cut was not too bad, but the wall was definitely like the channeling overflow right after it, the one with arrows and spreads. And the Mario Kart to the stack also quite tricky sometimes, but as there's spreads involved, but it's not too difficult. So I think I'm gonna put this on C tier just because it's slightly a bit harder than Ericthonios, but it's still not a very difficult fight. Moving on, third floor, Phoenix. Oh man, this is without a doubt one of the most difficult fight in the game. I'm definitely going to put it straight up to S, just because everything in this fight is hard. Like, the ads is so hard for the tanks, like you have to put some mitigations, but you still have to take into account that the next one after this is gonna be a tank buster. And it's just such a pain. And even after ads, every single mechanic after ads is a wall. Like the Glory Plume with the spread and stack, and then the FOF was a very tricky healer check, and the FOA was also very insane, like the spread, the stack, the bait tornado, the Mario Kart, holy shit. And even the death roll at the very last is a very hard healer check, especially if you're not using Astro. And I remember we were using White Mage, but luckily our White Mage was very giga chat, shout out to Kusha. Spread on Glory Plume is definitely one of the worst nightmare in PF, as it involves the whole group to move in to one direction and then spread. And this is where I learned that spread mechanics, even though it's a very simple concept, it's always a wall for PF. But P3S is also the place where I learn a lot as a raid lead. Like, I learned that as a raid lead I have to feel the sense of responsibility to move the proc forward for the static and to solve the problems we have. Like I remember one of our member was struggling and kept wiping the party during FOF, if I remember correctly. And then we did run through thoughts, we checked a lot of stuff, we checked the replays on FFLogs and stuff, and we solved the problem with tweaks and some strat. It did improve my mentality as a raid leader. Like I cannot just blame everyone for messing up mechanics or messing up something. Like they're clearly having difficulties, they know they're doing it wrong but they don't know why. And then as a raid lead you have to prioritize the group, but not just kick the guy and then move on forward, but rather to solve the problem that you have at that time. And we did. It's not just me, like everyone else also chime in like on how we can improve stuff. So it's a really good experience. And the worst part about this fight is everything's fucking orange. It hurts my eyes and I hate it. The arena was orange, the boss is orange, the mechanic is orange, the tether is orange. Holy shit, man. This is, it just hurts my eyes and I fucking hate it. Moving on to 4th floor, phase 1, Asphodelus. I think this fight is cool and original. Like although Pionex was a wall because of spread and stack, it feels it's still not that bad compared to PVS. The orbs was annoying, but not too hard. Like the towers is probably the next wall after Pionex because it includes the virus mechanic, and often I saw people snatching each other's tethers. But overall it's not too difficult, so but still very tricky overall. And I'm not sure, I'm not sure where to put. I think I'm gonna put it at B. At first I thought I'm gonna put it at A, but now that I think about it, it's not that bad. The phase 2, oh man, this brings a lot of nostalgic feeling. This is the fight in PF where I bond with my partner Luca, and where I get to meet some of my best friends right now. And the hardest mech in this fight, I would say the Act 2 for the first half, and then the Act 4 on the second half. And I'm not even taking into account that you're doing this blind, as we were definitely not blind when we started progging this, but I couldn't imagine solving this mech blind as it requires so much brain power, or well, maybe I'm just too stupid, but Act 2 was insane when you think about it, where the tether spawns and then you need to resolve it differently. Like the DPS needs to pop which DPS needs to pop the tether, and then which tank needs to take the tower, and then they need to move clockwise. Holy shit, like I really respect whoever came up and really able to solve this on blind procs. And Act 3 was not too bad. I remember Xeno strat was used for this for a lot of PF, but sometimes PF tend to forget the anti-knockback. Probably the next wall is the Act 4, but once you understand it, it's not as hard as Act 2, I feel like. It's actually mind-blowing on how people was able to actually solve the mechanic blind. But yeah, after Act 4, the finale is very easy, as long as you can count to 8. And the curtain call, definitely a tight healer check, but it's not that bad. And I do remember sometimes people do mess up in the sequence on who's to pop first and at what second, and it's kind of tricky, but it's not too bad. Overall, I'm putting it at A just because of Act 2 and Act 4 and on how difficult it was on PF, and on it was also pretty difficult for us when we did progged. Like I think we took the most time in Act 2. Like I remember we breezed to Act 3, and Act 4 took a while, but Act 2 was definitely a very tricky mechanic. So yeah, this is my tier list for Asphodelus, and it was a very memorable tier for me, not only because it's my first raid leading experience, but it's also where I get to meet so many people who ended up being my best friend. On to the next tier, Abysos. Prior to this raid tier, our friend group expanded well enough to create like 3 separate raid groups. Because between Asphodelus and Abysos, our friend group did like T and DSR together with different members. Then when Abysos drops, I went with my partner Luca and her close friends, bringing along my H2 and longtime friend Nyonya with some of his friends. And that's the first iteration of our static Jaro and friends. We did pretty good and cleared at week 4, which at that time was our personal best clear. So now we go to P5S. This is actually the fight where my YouTube actually started gaining traction with Luca's Devour Dodge video, which was very impressive of Luca. I'm just stealing her content for figuring it out just a few hours after we prog. This fight was a massive step up of entry floor level to Savage from the previous tier, as this is significantly more difficult than P1S. The obvious wall would be Devour, but it's rather a personal movement and it's been made easy with the Luca dodge and the back and forth movement. The harder part that I feel in this fight that is a major wall was actually Ruby Gold 5, as the spread actually kills a lot of group. You may be too close, not baiting it right, too far, or not moving fast enough. It's a major wall for most of groups, even in PF. But overall, it's not insanely hard, so I will put it at B. The next one is P6S. This is probably the easiest fight this tier has to offer, and I'm putting it straight at D. There's not much difficult mechanic as the first major wall is probably Cachexia 1, but Cachexia 1 is not that hard with the new strats coming out. It's quite tricky when we did progged blind, but with strats like ZZZip where you're stationary, it's very easy to execute. The second wall, which is the hardest part of this fight in my opinion, is probably Cachexia 2, if you're doing it correctly. But the sad thing is that this mech can actually be cheesed with Tank LB3, which ignores the mechanic completely. That's why I'm putting P6S on the bottom of my list. Well, it's probably slightly harder than P1S due to the overall mechanic, but still on the D tier. The third one, P7S. I actually have a mixed feeling about this one. The whole fight is actually pretty boring until the arena change for purgation happens, and the next 3 major mechanic was the wall. But Sleepo actually made it easy for purgation, which should be the first wall, with what we call at the time the illegal waymark. We did proc most of the fight blind, but just when we were starting to prog purgation, the strat came out and we ended up breezing through P7S with that strat. In terms of difficulty, I will put it a bit high at A if it's not for Sleepo's purgation, as the other 2 wall, which is War and Death, is pretty difficult, as you might clip some of the cleaves and you might bait the Minotaur wrong, and it's pretty punishing. So I'm just gonna put it at B. Moving on to the next one, P8S Phase 1. Holy Moses, this is without a single shred of doubt the hardest fight in this expansion, period. Without a single doubt. It is so hard that they had to nerf it after week 2 with the DPS check being that insane. And even after the nerf, the PF still actually struggles a lot with the DPS check. But that's not even the hardest thing with P8S Phase 1. The mechanic is difficult enough that you had to dodge the gaze and then gaze the snake that can freeze your teammates, but also the fact that the timeline is actually different if it's Centaur first or Snake first. If you're an experienced raider, you know how tricky different timeline is, as it means that you need to have different sets of mitigation for each scenario and execute your raid buffs differently. The first Centaur mech is not too bad, but the first Snake is already a wall for most PF, as the slightest greed might cause a wipe. The next wall is probably the fourfold, where it involves spread and stack as we already know, and it's a nightmare. And both the second transformation is just insane. The second Centaur is hard enough as it is a trio with 3 sets of movement that you have to remember, and the death interval in between makes you lose focus, and then it gives you a false sense of security and confusion, and you might die after that. And then the second Snake is, holy shit, it's insane. Like, there's a lot of things happening at once. Like, you have to dodge the snake, gaze the snake, puddle the snake, find a clone, find a safe spot, then use priority to sort 2 groups to have each one puddle and one gaze, and then the gaze and the puddle needs to stand really accurate or they will kill the entire party. Like, that's actually insane, man. The phase 1 is definitely the hardest fight in this whole Savage tier. I really hate it. The last one on this tier, P8S phase 2. I think this is also one of the most difficult fight in the tier, but it's not as hard as the first phase. While solving the mechanics like natural alignment and high concept is insanely hard, we actually didn't prog it blind, and once the strats are out, it's actually not that hard to do. Like the P7S, the first half of the fight isn't too bad, and although can sometimes kill people in natural alignment spreads, it's still not too hard to do. Like, the major wall is probably the last few mechanics, which is natural alignment 2, that requires you to check the inverse and then stand on a single row for the spreads and stacks. The next wall is probably high concept 2, with everyone pretty much involved in the mechanic, unlike high concept 1. The Dominion is actually pretty easy, but sometimes people lose focus and it's very punishing when you fail the Dominion. But overall, I don't think it's as hard as phase 1, so I'm putting it at A. I think it's still easier than the phase 2 of P4S, but it's still hard enough to be at A tier. I think that's it for Abysos tier. We will be moving on to the last tier, Anabas. So our statics since Abyssos decided to stick through together from Abyssos and top to Anabaseus, with minor member changes each tier. Initially, I wasn't supposed to be there for the last Savage, but I ended up with the static and raid leading again. This group was pretty stacked with skilled Indonesian players except for me, of course, and we were aiming for week 2 this time. The pace was very fast right off the bat. We cleared P9S within 2 lockouts blind on release, and P10S actually took a while, but we cleared day 3. We cleared P11S in 2 lockouts also, and by week 1 we were set to proc P12S. But unfortunately our main tank's PC exploded when we started progging P12S phase 1, and we had to scramble and find replacement. And at that time, not many Indonesian tank is at that proc point. We did manage to find one from our friend group, but ended up settling with an international tank and had to shift the comms. We juggled around 3 to 4 tanks just to get the proc going until we got a friend who managed to commit till our clear. We ended up clearing early week 3, but no doubt in our head that if the unfortunate incident didn't happen, we will for sure back that week to clear, as the momentum was really good until it happened. But still, week 3 is our best clear yet in Savage, so we're still pretty happy about it. Now onto the fight itself. P9S, the first one. This is in my opinion quite similar to P5S in difficulty. It got a trio movement mechanic as a wall in 11 strike and another wall after in chimeric succession. Although the level design is quite similar, they have fast paced movement in between and difficult trio in the middle and another wall after. I think the first half of P9S is slightly more punishing than P5S, as failing 11 strike will instantly kill your party. While if it's one people dying in Devour, you will only get damage down due to the tower. But if we compare the second half, P9S is more recoverable than P5S. As we see in Chimeric Succession, it's more recoverable than Ruby Glow 5, as Ruby Glow was immediately followed up with stacks to tower resolve, and usually if someone died in Ruby Glow 5 spreads or bait, you will instantly wipe. So I'm gonna put it side to side with P5S in B tier. But well, I also feel P7S is probably slightly more difficult than this too, just because of the last 3 mechs is is very punishing. Next one, P10S. Oh man. This took us the longest to proc. This fight is insanely hard. The fact that they do 3 kinds of stacks and spreads with single, pair and roll stack is tough already. And to do it 4 times with different variations with prior mechanic is just insane. The tank heavy mech is also tricky, where the tank busters are towers that send you flying. You might fall off the edge if you're too far or too close. And then they also made the tanks become ping pong balls with the turret mechanic. It's also a healer check, with every mechanic dealing an insane amount of damage, and the harrowing hell is just nightmare for healers, especially the newer ones. And we're not even talking about the walls yet. The first wall might be the turrets, as you might bait it wrong or even forget the bonds after with spread and pair. The second wall is probably bond 3, because the second resolve is extremely tricky as it followed up with the laser ball and make the space even tighter than it already is. The next wall is definitely Dividing Wings 3 followed up with Harrowing Hell. There's a lot of stuff going on here where you have to make the web barrier behind. If it's too far from the corner it might fail, too close to corner and you might clip the Dividing Wings. Also followed up with a Holy Cliff up front and stacks that produce strings that needs to be cut off. And of course the Harrowing Hell itself being a heal and mid check, followed up with another bond. I'm definitely putting this on S tier, not only because of how difficult it is to proc, but even with strats out, it's still so hard to do it cleanly in PF. And I don't think it's actually harder than P3S or P8S phase 1 on patch, but it's definitely up there amongst them. On to the next one, P11S. Let me just say what everyone is thinking. Yes, it feels like a reskin of E11S. It's very similar but a bit toned down and easier to do, due to the line cleave and the side cleave. But the big mechanics are quite different in Dark and Light and Letter of Law. I honestly am a big fan of E11S, and E11S is a better fight overall in my opinion. And although P11S music is probably still the best music in Savage tier, but this is not a music tier list, it is a difficult tier list. So the fight itself is very intuitive and not too difficult. The first wall is probably Dark and Light, but it's just sorting out priority, and once you are used to it, it's pretty easy. The tricky part is only the pair and stack, but as long as you have sprint, it is very easy to do. And then the other wall is probably the last major mechanic, which is Letter of Law, but that too is not too hard once you have the sequence all mapped out. The only hard thing about this fight is the duration, as it's quite long compared to the other floors. Like the first time we did this, I think without year is probably around 10 minutes. And then I think with BIS you can take it down till like 9:30. But overall this is the easiest floor of this tier, so I'm putting it at D. But it's still probably harder than P6S or P1S, since it requires better execution than both of these. Next one, P12S phase 1. This is in my opinion also one of the hardest fights in this tier, but it's definitely not the magnitude of P8S phase 1 as a door boss. The early half is okay. The first tricky part, but not necessarily a wall, is probably Super Chain, as there's a lot of things going on at once and it's also a burst window. Then everything after Para 3 is a wall. Well, Para 3 itself is a wall, but it's pretty easy for supports, and it's kinda trickier for the DPS as the place where they stand really matters a lot. If you move slightly to the right or slightly to the left, you might clip and die, and it's very punishing. The second wall would be the limit cut, not because of the numbers, but because of the timing of the clone bait, since it's different every time depending on whether the clone is light or dark, and during our proc we need to call out to execute that very well. After that, the 2A and 2B super chain is definitely the toughest, but I would say 2A is slightly tougher than 2B. There's a lot of stuff going on there, with where we start, stand in, see the cliff, bet the pairs, move straight or back. It's definitely a very tough mechanic to get through, and while doing DPS, obviously. And I'm gonna put this fight on. Well, I don't think this is quite on the level of P10S or P3S or PLS Phase 1, but it's still definitely up there. I think it's a very execution heavy fight. Okay, now onto the last of last, P12S Phase 2. Man, this is in my opinion is a very well designed fight. All the mechanic feels original, the UAV, the caloric with the length of movement, the classical where you block the tethers depending on your symbol. It is a fantastic fight in my opinion. Compared to all of the other last boss, the DPS check in this fight is extremely lenient. The moment we went past caloric 2 for the first time, we cleared immediately. Even with the few deaths, and we didn't even get to see the enraged cast bar. The fight mechanic itself is pretty difficult and quite punishing. The first wall is definitely caloric, as you might need to feel the length of movement, but as soon as you know it, it's gonna be pretty easy. The second wall would be Pangenesis, and this is probably confused a lot of people, but knowing that the same colored tower will always spawn south actually helps us a lot during our prog to realize that it's not that hard, as the movement is pretty consistent and you only need to pay attention to your buff. The next wall is probably classical too, but you can do it with cheat sheet macro, or if you're good at flipping stuff in your head, it should be no problem for you. And probably the last one is caloric 2, where it's actually pretty simple but very punishing, since the slightest missed movement or single gap close will wipe the entire party. And after that, the UAV 2 is pretty easy and it's also very recoverable, even though you have a lot of deaths there. So I think I'm gonna put it at, actually I'm gonna put it at high B tier, above P4S. If only the DPS check is not this lenient, I probably will put it at A, but since it is very recoverable and the DPS check is very lenient, I think I'm gonna put it at the highest B tier. But I really enjoyed this fight. So this whole 2 years of Savage raiding has been a great highlight for me, and I get to meet a lot of new people, making new friends, and it really meant a lot for me. And I actually didn't know that I could bond with people this much through game and through Savage raiding, and I'm very grateful for that. And that's it for this Savage raid difficulty tier list. Again, this is a very subjective tier list. You are free to have your own opinion, but this is just my opinion as a week 3 or 4 clearer in this expansion for Savage raids. So feel free to leave a comment down below if you think differently, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done so. And that's about it. See ya.